No, we are not wasting another life trying to prove a human can do the impossible. The words struck the council chamber like a slammed door. Every conversation stopped. Every holographic display went still. And for one long second, hundreds of delegates from across the galaxy seemed to forget how to breathe. Then, almost as one, they turned toward the back of the chamber, toward the man who had spoken, Daniel Carter. He didn't look like a genius. He wasn't wearing ceremonial robes. He wasn't surrounded by assistants, security officers, or floating screens filled with complicated equations. He was wearing an ordinary charcoal gray work jacket, the kind a mechanic might wear. And in a strange way, that was exactly what made the room uncomfortable. Daniel slowly looked around. For a moment, he genuinely wondered if the director was talking about someone else. After all, nobody had invited him to the Galactic Engineering Council to speak. Nobody had asked for his opinion. And certainly nobody expected a human repair technician to stand in front of representatives from 43 civilizations and challenge them. Daniel had spent 12 years fixing things other people had already given up on. Damaged fusion arrays, broken docking systems, malfunctioning cargo elevators, mining equipment, orbital machinery, civilian reactors. The kind of machines that never appeared in history books because when they worked, nobody cared. But when they stopped working, Daniel was usually the man somebody called at 3 a.m. High Director Sin slowly folded all 4 of his hands behind his back. His silver-blue skin shimmered beneath the enormous white lights of the chamber. "Human," he said calmly, "this problem has defeated the greatest minds of 43 civilizations." A massive display appeared above him. Ancient schematics rotated through the air. Entire civilizations. Thousands of engineers. Centuries of research. Millions of calculations. All leading to the same conclusion. Failure. Sin continued. "We have sacrificed decades, fortunes, reputations, and lives." He paused. "We will not sacrifice another engineer simply to satisfy your species' optimism." A quiet wave of agreement moved through the chamber. Daniel heard the whispers. Some weren't even trying to hide them. Humans improvise too much. Humans guess. They break things before understanding them. Daniel had heard versions of those words before. Back on Earth. Back in Ohio. People had said the same things whenever he tried repairing an engine everyone else wanted to replace. And every time, his father had given him the same little smile. You never know what still works until you open it up. Daniel looked at the director. His hands remained inside his jacket pockets. "I'm not asking anyone to sacrifice anything." Sin raised an eyebrow. "I'm just asking to take a look." A few delegates laughed. Not cruelly. Almost worse than that. It was the kind of laughter adults gave when a child confidently volunteered to repair the moon. Then the lights dimmed. The enormous display rotated. And the object at the center of the crisis appeared. The Genesis Core. The oldest functioning machine in the known galaxy. A structure so ancient that nobody could say with certainty who had built it. It floated inside a magnetic containment sphere nearly 200 feet across. Thousands of components rotated around a glowing central core. Ancient alloys, unknown energy systems, layers of technology added by civilization after civilization. For thousands of years, the Genesis Core had connected the galaxy. Transportation lanes depended on it. Trade depended on it. Medical shipments depended on it. Entire colonies depended on it. And now, it was dying. Slowly, quietly, without warning. Every simulation predicted the same future. Within 6 months, transportation lanes across thousands of systems would begin collapsing. Trade routes would fail. Remote colonies would become isolated. Supply chains would disappear. Entire worlds could be left waiting months, or even years, for essential supplies. Not because of war. Not because someone had attacked them. Not because an enemy fleet was approaching. Simply because the oldest machine in the galaxy was running out of balance. Daniel stared at the rotating model. Everyone else saw impossible engineering. Daniel saw something else. Symmetry. Perfect symmetry. Too perfect. He leaned forward slightly. A council member noticed. "You're smiling." Daniel blinked. "Sorry. What could possibly be amusing?" "Nothing." He shrugged. It's just every briefing packet keeps calling this machine impossible. Another few laughs. Daniel continued. My dad used to say that's usually another way of saying nobody wants to admit they're looking at it the wrong way. The laughter disappeared. High Director Sin stepped forward. Human Daniel Carter. His voice became quieter. If every civilization tells you something cannot be done, perhaps wisdom lies in listening. Daniel met his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. Maybe. A pause. Or maybe that's exactly when someone should ask why. Silence. Complete silence. And somewhere beyond the walls of the council chamber, the Genesis core released another deep vibration. A low mechanical pulse rolled through the station. Almost like a heartbeat. Almost like a warning. Daniel looked toward the enormous machine, and for reasons he couldn't explain yet, he felt certain that the Genesis core wasn't simply breaking. It was trying to tell them something. The council chamber slowly emptied. Nobody congratulated him. Nobody rushed toward him. Nobody asked him how he planned to solve a problem that had defeated thousands of engineers. Most delegates simply walked past. Some looked annoyed. Others looked amused. A few looked at him with the expression people usually reserve for someone who had just volunteered for a suicide mission. Daniel didn't mind. In fact, he found it strangely comforting. It meant nobody expected anything from him. Then a voice came from behind. Mr. Carter? Daniel turned. A woman stood several feet away. She was nearly 7 feet tall, with pale blue skin and silver eyes that seemed permanently focused on details other people missed. Her white laboratory coat carried the insignia of the Galactic Research Authority. Dr. Lyra Soren. She extended one of her four-fingered hands. Daniel shook it. Daniel Carter. I know. That sounds ominous. It isn't. Good. She looked toward the doors. I have been assigned to escort you. Daniel smiled. Assigned? Yes. That sounds very official. It is. Daniel glanced toward the Genesis core. Does that mean you believe I can fix it? Lyra hesitated. Just long enough. No. Daniel laughed. Fair enough. They started walking. Transparent corridors stretched through the enormous station. Beyond them, ships from dozens of civilizations drifted through space. Cargo freighters, diplomatic cruisers, medical transports, mining vessels. Every one of them silently depended on the machine nobody truly understood anymore. Lyra glanced at Daniel. You are remarkably calm. Shouldn't I be? You were just told that every recognized expert believes this task cannot be completed. Daniel rested his hands against the railing. Back home, I've seen 12 mechanics spend 2 hours arguing about why an old pickup truck could never start again. Lyra waited. What happened? My dad handed me a wrench. She looked at him. And he told me to quit listening and start looking. For the first time, Lyra almost smiled. The transport platform arrived. They stepped inside. The doors closed. And the platform began descending hundreds of feet toward the engineering complex. Daniel looked down through the transparent floor. The station disappeared above them. Below waited the machine that had defeated the greatest minds in the galaxy. And for the first time, Daniel realized something. He wasn't being taken there because they believed he could save it. He was being taken there because they had run out of people to believe in, and that was a very different thing. The transport platform stopped with a soft mechanical hiss. The doors opened. Daniel stepped out and stopped walking. For several seconds, he simply stared. The engineering complex was enormous. It wasn't a laboratory in the ordinary sense. It felt more like an entire city built around a machine. Engineers from dozens of civilizations moved between enormous workstations. Holographic equations floated above their heads. Maintenance drones moved through restricted areas. Robotic arms adjusted microscopic components. Screens displayed energy readings, structural maps, thermal patterns, quantum fluctuations. Everywhere Daniel looked, there was evidence of intelligence. Thousands of years of it. And yet, nobody looked confident. They looked exhausted. Daniel noticed the coffee cups first, then the food containers, then the blankets. Some engineers had apparently been sleeping beside their workstations. Stacks of handwritten notes covered several tables. The technology was extraordinary. The people using it looked defeated. Lyra noticed Daniel staring. What? Daniel shook his head. Nothing. That usually means something. He pointed toward the engineers. This is not a room full of people who stop caring. Lyra crossed her arms. No. Daniel watched a technician pull up another failed simulation. This is a room full of people who have been trying the same answers for too long. Lyra studied him. And what makes you think your answers will be different? Daniel smiled. I don't. She raised an eyebrow. Daniel turned toward the observation window. I haven't come here to prove I'm smarter than everyone else. He looked through the glass. I came here to figure out what everyone else stopped noticing. That answer stayed with Lyra. She didn't respond. Instead, she handed him a security badge and a thin data tablet. Everything discovered over the last 3,112 years is here. Daniel looked at the tablet. All of it. All of it. He whistled softly. That is a lot of homework. It contains more than 9 billion individual observations. Daniel looked at her. I guess I'm skipping lunch. Lyra almost smiled, then stopped herself. Do not underestimate what you're reading. I don't. Daniel walked toward an empty workstation overlooking the Genesis core. The ancient machine floated behind reinforced glass. Massive rings rotated around its glowing center. Slowly, perfectly, almost peacefully, Daniel sat down. He opened the archive and immediately regretted asking for everything. The first page contained thousands of equations. The second contained thousands more. Then came simulations, failure reports, structural analyses, energy models, historical maintenance records, warnings, attempt rejected, structural instability, catastrophic resonance, infinite energy requirement, impossible. Daniel scrolled. Another failure. Another. Every page told the same story in a different language. Thousands of brilliant minds had tried. Thousands had failed. And every generation had added another explanation for why the next generation would fail too. After nearly 4 hours, Daniel rubbed his eyes. He leaned back. Something bothered him. He looked at the screen, then toward the Genesis core, then back at the screen. Slowly, he realized what he'd been doing wrong. He had spent 4 hours reading what everyone else believed. He had barely spent 5 minutes watching the machine itself. Daniel closed the archive. Across the room, 2 senior engineers noticed. One leaned toward the other. He has stopped taking notes. The other glanced at Daniel. Humans lose focus quickly. He'll request transportation home before the end of the cycle. Daniel heard them. He ignored them. He stood, walked to the observation glass, and looked at the Genesis core. Really looked. The machine rotated. One ring, then another, then another. The light pulsed through the center. Maintenance drones moved around the surface. Tiny, almost invisible. The entire machine seemed perfectly controlled, perfectly synchronized, perfectly balanced. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Something was wrong. Not with the machine, with the way everyone was looking at it. Lyra approached from behind carrying 2 cups. Coffee. Daniel took one. He smelled it, then took a sip. His face changed. Lyra watched him. Bad. Daniel considered it. It is trying its best. That isn't a compliment. No. He smiled. But I appreciate the effort. They stood quietly. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Lyra asked, Do you know how many engineers have stood exactly where you are standing? Daniel looked through the glass. A lot. 6,419. Daniel slowly turned toward her. All of them, some of the greatest minds their civilizations ever produced. And none found the answer. No. Daniel nodded. I believe that. Lyra frowned. You don't sound discouraged. Should I? Yes. Why? Because you're standing in front of the same machine that defeated all of them. Daniel looked at the Genesis core again. Maybe. Lyra waited. Daniel took another sip of coffee. Or maybe 6,419 people made the same mistake. Lyra's expression hardened. You think you're better than them? No. Then what do you think? Daniel placed the cup down. If 12 mechanics tell you an old engine can't be repaired, that's important information. Lyra nodded. Exactly. Daniel smiled. But it doesn't tell you why they couldn't repair it. She stared at him. He continued. It tells me 12 good mechanics already tried. That sounds like a reason to quit. Depends how you hear it. Daniel turned back toward the machine. If 12 smart people reach the same conclusion, there's a pretty good chance they all started with the same assumption. Before Lyra could answer, a soft alarm echoed through the engineering complex. Every screen changed. Amber. The Genesis core had slowed. Barely. Less than 1%. A change so small that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Daniel did. Engineers immediately began issuing commands. Technicians rushed toward their consoles. Diagnostic systems came online. Lyra looked at the readings. Another fluctuation. Daniel didn't answer. He watched the machine. Nobody in the room looked surprised. That bothered him more than the alarm. They looked resigned, as if they had already accepted that the Genesis core would eventually stop. The only thing left to determine was when. Daniel looked around. Thousands of engineers, billions of observations, centuries of simulations. And yet everyone was doing the same thing, measuring how much time remained. Daniel returned to his workstation. Then he did something that immediately confused everyone nearby. He turned off his tablet. One by one, the holographic equations disappeared. An elderly engineer looked over. Your interface has failed. Daniel shook his head. No. He stood. I turned it off. Why? Daniel glanced at the dozens of floating equations surrounding the room. Because I keep seeing everyone else's answers. The engineer looked genuinely confused. That is the purpose of research. Sometimes, Daniel started walking. Sometimes it also keeps you from asking new questions. He left the workstation. Lyra followed. Where are you going? Nowhere. That makes no sense. I know. He walked around the circular observation deck. But this time, Daniel didn't stare at the glowing center. He watched the maintenance crews. He watched the drones. He watched the technicians replacing sensors. He watched what they touched, what they avoided, what they repaired. And then he listened. The Genesis core filled the chamber with a steady mechanical rhythm. Deep, slow, almost too quiet to notice. The station's computers filtered it out as meaningless background vibration. Daniel stopped walking, closed his eyes, and listened. 1 second. 2. 3. Lyra watched him. What are you doing? Daniel didn't answer. She waited. Daniel? Still nothing. He kept listening. Finally, he opened his eyes. What? I hear nothing unusual. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Lyra frowned. You're going to have to explain that. Daniel leaned against the railing. When I was 14, my dad rebuilt an old truck. Lyra sighed. Your father again. He was usually right. That sounds inconvenient. Daniel smiled. Very. He looked toward the Genesis core. Everyone said the truck belonged in a junkyard. What happened? My dad shut off the radio. Lyra waited. He just stood beside the engine, listening. Yeah. For what? Daniel smiled. He told me something I've never forgotten. He looked at the machine. Every machine tells you what hurts, if you stop talking long enough. Lyra slowly turned toward the Genesis core. You think this machine is doing the same? Daniel looked at her. I don't know yet. Then he started walking again. This time, Lyra followed without another question. They continued around the observation deck. And the closer Daniel looked, the stranger things became. Some access panels were polished almost perfectly. Others were covered in centuries of dust. Replacement components came from completely different civilizations. Different materials, different designs, different philosophies. It was as if thousands of engineers had spent generations adding pieces to the same machine without ever stepping back to ask what the original machine had been. Daniel stopped. Who installed those stabilizers? Lyra checked her tablet. The Valyrian Engineering Authority. When? Approximately 800 years ago. Daniel pointed toward another section. And those? The outer cooling arrays? She checked again. 1300 years ago. Installed by the Archon Consortium. Daniel nodded. Different teams. Obviously. Different assumptions? Lyra frowned. Explain. Daniel pointed toward the Genesis core. Every repair was trying to save the machine. Yes. But what if every repair also changed it? Lyra looked through the glass. You think the Genesis core is failing because we kept fixing it? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. He paused. I'm saying I don't know what it looked like before everybody started improving it. That sentence changed the atmosphere. Lyra didn't answer. Neither did Daniel. Across the chamber, two senior engineers noticed them examining the older systems. One quietly laughed. The human is inspecting maintenance records instead of quantum field equations. Another shook his head. He's avoiding the real problem because he can't understand it. Daniel heard them. He didn't react. He kept walking. Then he reached the oldest section of the observation platform. Almost hidden beneath newer equipment was a faded bronze plaque. Daniel stopped. He brushed away a layer of dust. Words slowly appeared. He read them aloud. Original harmonic balance preserved. Lyra stepped closer. That's old. How old? Older than most of our surviving records. Daniel looked at the plaque, then at the Genesis core, then back at the words, preserved. Lyra nodded. That phrase isn't used in modern engineering manuals. Daniel smiled. Not because he had discovered the solution. He hadn't. But because for the first time since arriving, he had discovered something much more valuable. A question. One that nobody else seemed to be asking. And sometimes, the right question is more dangerous than the wrong answer. The next morning, Daniel made a request that stopped the entire engineering division. He wanted to disconnect one of the secondary stabilization arrays. Not permanently. Not even for long. Just long enough to see what the Genesis core would do without it. The request reached High Director Sin within minutes. The answer came back almost immediately. Denied. Daniel wasn't surprised. What he hadn't expected was what happened next. Less than an hour later, High Director Sin himself entered the observation bay. The room went quiet. Engineers stopped talking. Technicians looked up from their consoles. Sin walked toward Daniel and stopped beside the glass. Your proposal has been reviewed. Daniel nodded. I assumed it had. Every engineer on the advisory council voted against it. I figured. Sin turned toward him. Do you know why? Daniel looked at the Genesis core. Because they think I'm about to make things worse. They do. Sin's voice remained calm. Every simulation predicts a measurable decrease in system stability if that array is removed. Daniel nodded slowly. Has anyone ever tested the prediction? Silence. Sin's expression changed slightly. Of course not. Why? Because the risk is unacceptable. Daniel looked at the machine, then back at Sin. So the simulation has never been proven right either. Several engineers nearby exchanged frustrated looks. One of them stepped forward. His identification badge read, Senior Engineer Tavik. He was one of the most respected engineers in the complex, and he clearly wasn't impressed. Human, Tavik said. Our models have been refined for more than 3,000 years. Daniel nodded. I believe you. Tavik frowned. Then why do you continue challenging them? Daniel thought for a moment. Because every model starts with assumptions. Tavik crossed his arms. Are you claiming the greatest scientific community in history made the same mistake? Daniel looked at him. No. He paused. I think thousands of brilliant people inherited the same first chapter without realizing it. The room went completely still. Lyra watched Tavik carefully. This wasn't about the Genesis core anymore. Not entirely. It was about something much harder for brilliant people to accept. That intelligence doesn't protect you from assumptions. Tavik activated a holographic projection. Layer after layer of the Genesis core appeared above the floor. Every modification, every upgrade, every stabilization system, every cooling mechanism, every correction made over thousands of years. The image looked less like a machine and more like a history book written in metal. Tavik pointed toward the highlighted sections. Every modification improved system efficiency. Daniel stepped closer. Did it? Tavik blinked. What? Daniel pointed toward the projection. Every upgrade improved one specific problem. Yes, but nobody asked what all the upgrades were doing together. Tavik opened his mouth, then stopped. Nobody answered. Daniel continued. My father used to joke that if 5 different mechanics repaired the same truck without talking to each other, eventually the headlights would work perfectly while the steering wheel fell off. A few younger technicians laughed. They quickly stopped when they realized the senior engineers weren't laughing. Sin remained expressionless. Colorful stories are not evidence. Daniel nodded. No. He looked back at the Genesis core, but they remind us that common sense still matters. Then the machine pulsed. A deep vibration moved through the observation deck. Daniel stopped. His expression changed. He closed his eyes. The others watched him. Another pulse. Daniel counted silently. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he opened his eyes. There it is. Lyra stepped closer. What? Daniel looked toward the outer rings. The rhythm changes every time the stabilizers compensate. Tavik immediately shook his head. Impossible. Daniel looked at him. Why? The compensators respond after the harmonic cycle. Exactly. Tavik frowned. Daniel continued. Have you ever listened without watching the monitors? Tavik didn't answer. Daniel looked at Lyra. She already understood what he was asking. Pull up the live telemetry. Lyra moved to the nearest console. Daniel pointed toward the audio systems. And give me the raw acoustic recording. She hesitated. Our acoustic sensors aren't part of the primary diagnostic system. That's why I want them. Lyra brought up the recording. The chamber filled with the Genesis core's unfiltered sound. Deep, low, almost musical. She overlaid it with the live telemetry. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then Lyra froze. Her fingers stopped above the controls. Daniel noticed. What? She zoomed in. Again. Then again. The difference was tiny. Less than a fraction of a second. But it was there. Lyra's eyes widened. The delay. Tavik moved closer. What delay? She pointed at the screen. The harmonic shift happens first. Nobody spoke. The stabilizers respond afterward. Tavik stared at the data. No. Lyra replayed it. Again. And again. The same result. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Lyra slowly looked at him. The machine isn't following the stabilizers. Her voice dropped. The stabilizers are chasing the machine. The room went silent. Tavik stared at the Genesis core as though he'd never seen it before. For 3,000 years, everyone had believed the stabilization systems were controlling the machine. They weren't. They were reacting to it. And every time they reacted, they were introducing another correction, another adjustment, another layer. The machine would respond. The stabilizers would respond again. Then another system would compensate for that response. And another. And another. Until thousands of years later, the galaxy had built an enormous network of technology whose purpose was to correct a problem that might never have existed in the first place. Daniel finally spoke. We've been treating the symptom for centuries. No one laughed. No one argued. Nobody called him reckless. For the first time since Daniel entered the facility, the room simply listened. Lyra immediately began running independent verification. She pulled data from separate sensor systems, different manufacturers, different civilizations, different measurement techniques. Daniel watched quietly. 2 hours later, the results arrived. Every system confirmed the same thing. The stabilizers were reacting after the Genesis core changed. Not before, not causing the change. Following it, a quiet murmur spread through the engineering floor. Some engineers stared at their screens. Others stared at the machine. A few simply sat down. Because this discovery didn't solve the Genesis core. It did something more dangerous. It cracked certainty. For thousands of years, the engineering community had operated under one basic assumption. The Genesis core was unstable. Therefore, it needed more stabilization. Now Daniel had exposed the possibility that the exact opposite might be true. Maybe the machine wasn't unstable. Maybe it had been fighting the stabilizers. Lyra approached Daniel. You were right about the maintenance history. Daniel looked at her. About what? She held up a stack of archived records. Every civilization added something. Daniel waited. Nobody removed anything. Daniel slowly nodded. That is what I was afraid of. She handed him the records. The original builders left almost no documentation. That makes sense. Lyra frowned. How? Daniel looked through the old records. If they understood the machine completely, they probably didn't think anyone would forget how it worked. Lyra stared at him. That is surprisingly human. Daniel laughed. Trust me. He flipped through another page. We lose instruction manuals all the time. They spent the rest of the afternoon comparing maintenance records. Thousands of years, thousands of modifications. Every generation had believed it had improved the Genesis core. Another safeguard, another optimization, another correction, another improvement. But nobody had asked the simplest question. What if the previous generation had already solved the problem? What if every new generation had simply misunderstood the original solution? By evening, the wall-sized historical timeline had become almost impossible to look at. Layer after layer, century after century, civilization after civilization. The machine had become buried beneath its own history. Daniel leaned back. Lyra looked at him. "You've figured something out." Daniel stared at the timeline. "I think I know what happened." "What?" He pointed toward the thousands of modifications. Everybody thought the machine was becoming weaker. Lyra nodded. "Yes." Daniel shook his head. "No." She waited. It became harder to understand. Before Lyra could respond, someone approached them. Tavik, the same engineer who had dismissed Daniel the day before. He was holding several diagnostic reports. His expression was different now. There was no mockery, no irritation, only uncertainty. Daniel looked up. Tavik hesitated over the unfamiliar first name. "Would you review these harmonic maps?" Daniel accepted the reports. "Sure." Tavik watched him study the data. Then he spoke quietly. "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked surprised. "For what?" "I dismissed your methods because they were unconventional." Daniel shrugged. "That happens." Tavik shook his head. "No." He looked toward the Genesis core. "It happens because we confused experience with certainty." The words hung in the air. Around them, something strange was happening. Researchers who had ignored Daniel were reopening old files. Teams were comparing records they had previously dismissed. Engineers were questioning conclusions that had been accepted for centuries. Nobody had repaired the Genesis core. Not yet. But the engineering complex no longer felt like a museum protecting old ideas. It felt like a workshop again. Daniel walked alone toward the observation window. The Genesis core continued its slow rotation. Steady, silent, patient. Daniel placed one hand against the glass. "You've been trying to tell us something this whole time." Behind him, Lyra stopped. Daniel smiled faintly. "We just kept interrupting." And for the first time, the machine's rhythm sounded different. Not because the Genesis core had changed, but because everyone in the room had finally stopped assuming they already knew what they were hearing. The council chamber had never been this quiet. Not during wars. Not during diplomatic crises. Not even when entire planets had requested emergency evacuation. Because this time, nobody knew whether they were about to witness a breakthrough or a disaster. Daniel stood alone at the center of the chamber. Behind him, the Genesis core rotated in a massive holographic projection. Its thousands of components glowed in the air. Every ring, every stabilizer, every correction system, every modification added across thousands of years. High Director Sin sat at the center of the council. Around him were representatives from dozens of civilizations. Some had traveled across half the galaxy to attend. Others had joined through remote projections. Everyone had the same question. What exactly was Daniel Carter proposing? Sin folded his hands. "You requested an emergency session." "Yes." "You requested permission to alter the Genesis core." "Yes." "You understand that the core supplies the primary transportation network for thousands of inhabited systems." Daniel nodded. "I understand. You understand that a failure could isolate entire civilizations." "I understand. And yet you are asking us to disable 12 auxiliary stabilization systems." Daniel looked around the chamber. "Yes." A murmur spread through the delegates. One representative immediately stood. "That is unacceptable." Another joined him. Those systems were installed specifically to prevent harmonic instability. Daniel nodded. "They were. Then why would we disable them?" Daniel turned toward the enormous holographic model. "Because they're not preventing the instability." He paused. "They're responding to it." The chamber became silent. Sin leaned forward. "You have demonstrated that the stabilizers respond after the harmonic shift." "Yes, but you have not demonstrated that removing them will improve the core." Daniel nodded. "No." That answer surprised everyone. Sin raised an eyebrow. You admit this? Of course. Daniel looked at him. Finding out that something is wrong doesn't automatically tell you what happens when you remove it. For the first time, several council members seemed interested. Daniel continued. That is exactly why I don't want to shut everything down. He pointed toward the holographic model. I want to isolate 12 auxiliary systems. Why 12? Because they're the most recent additions that directly compensate for the harmonic changes. An engineer projected a timeline. The 12 systems appeared in sequence. Each had been added during a different engineering era. Each had been designed to correct a slightly different form of instability. Daniel highlighted them. Individually, each system makes sense. He looked at the council. Together, they create a feedback loop. One delegate shook his head. That's theoretical. Yes. So your solution is to risk the entire transportation network based on a theory? Daniel smiled faintly. No. He pointed toward the data. I'm asking for a controlled test. The room remained tense. Daniel continued. We don't disconnect the core. We don't touch the primary energy system. We don't alter the central harmonic chamber. We temporarily bypass 12 auxiliary correction systems. He paused. 30 seconds. Someone laughed. 30 seconds? Daniel nodded. If I'm wrong, we restore them immediately. And if you're right, Daniel looked toward the holographic core. Then the machine should become more stable. The council erupted. Questions came from every direction. What if the harmonic field collapses? What if the core overloads? What if the transportation network destabilizes? What if the ancient containment system fails? Daniel stood quietly. He let them speak. Let them argue. Let them imagine every possible disaster. Then he raised one hand. The room slowly quieted. You're all asking what happens if we turn the systems off. He looked around. That's the wrong question. Sin watched him carefully. Daniel continued. The real question is what the Genesis core has been trying to do without them. Silence. A deep silence. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of people realizing they might have been asking the wrong question for 3,000 years. Sin finally spoke. How long have you been preparing this test? Daniel glanced at Lyra. About 14 hours. A few delegates looked offended. 14 hours? Yes. You expect this council to authorize a potentially catastrophic experiment after 14 hours? Daniel shrugged. No. He looked at the holographic data. I expect you to authorize it after 3,000 years of evidence. That stopped the room. Daniel continued. We've spent centuries adding systems because we were afraid of what the machine might do. He pointed toward the 12 highlighted modules. But nobody has asked what the machine does when we stop interfering. Sin leaned back. The council members began speaking quietly among themselves. Daniel waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, Sin raised one hand. The room fell silent. The proposal will proceed to technical review. Daniel nodded. That's fair. However, Sin paused. You will personally supervise the test. Daniel blinked. Me? You proposed it. Daniel looked at Lyra. She gave him a very small smile. Congratulations. Daniel sighed. That's not the word I'd use. The test was scheduled for 3 o'clock station time. The engineering complex transformed overnight. Every available technician was called in. Emergency systems were activated. Backup generators were placed on standby. Medical teams arrived. Evacuation corridors were opened. The 12 auxiliary systems were isolated one by one. Each appeared on Daniel's console. System 1. Ready. System 2. Ready. System 3. Ready. Daniel looked through the observation glass. The Genesis core continued rotating. It looked completely indifferent to the chaos surrounding it. Lyra stood beside him. Are you nervous? Yes. She looked surprised. You don't sound nervous. Daniel smiled. That's because I'm trying not to scare everyone else. Lyra laughed quietly. Then the countdown began. 30 seconds. 29. 28. Daniel watched the harmonic readings. 20. 19. 18. The engineers stopped talking. 10. 9. 8. Daniel placed his hand over the control panel. 7. 6. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. Bypass. 12 systems disconnected. Nothing happened. For half a second. Then, the Genesis core changed. Not violently. Not dramatically. It simply breathed. The outer rings slowed by a fraction. Then aligned. The harmonic field stabilized. Every monitor in the room changed simultaneously. Green. 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 The engineers froze. Daniel stared at the readings. Checked the independent sensors. Lyra immediately began running diagnostics. No error. Again. She repeated the test. No error. Tavik looked at the numbers. Energy fluctuation has dropped. How much? 17%. The room erupted. People shouted. Engineers rushed between consoles. Some started laughing. Others simply stared at the screens. Daniel didn't celebrate. He kept watching. Wait. Lyra looked at him. What? Something else is happening. She checked the telemetry. The harmonic frequency was changing. Slowly, but consistently. The Genesis core wasn't compensating anymore. It was settling, like a machine finally allowed to move the way it had been designed to move. 30 seconds passed. Daniel looked at the timer. Restore the systems. The 12 auxiliary stabilizers came back online. Instantly, the harmonic field changed again. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. The instability returned. Smaller than before, yet unmistakable. Everyone saw it. Tavik whispered, "They're disturbing it." Daniel nodded. Exactly. Nobody spoke. The test was over. 30 seconds. That's all it had taken. 3,000 years of assumptions had been challenged in half a minute. Sin's projection appeared on the main screen. Mr. Carter. Daniel turned. Yes, Director? What exactly have we learned? Daniel looked at the Genesis core. That the machine wasn't becoming unstable. He paused. We were making it unstable. The council chamber erupted again. But this time, the argument was different. Nobody was asking whether Daniel was wrong. They were asking how much damage had already been done. How many systems were interfering? How many modifications had become unnecessary? How much of the Genesis core's original design was still buried underneath thousands of years of engineering? And most importantly, could they reverse it? Daniel walked back toward the observation window. The machine looked calmer now, almost peaceful. Lyra stood beside him. You know what this means? Daniel nodded. We have to remove everything. Lyra looked at him. Not everything. Daniel smiled. No. He pointed toward the original core. We have to find the original balance. Behind them, alarms suddenly sounded. Daniel turned. Every screen in the room flashed red. The engineers rushed to their stations. Lyra's face changed. What happened? She stared at the telemetry. I don't know. Daniel stepped closer. Tell me. She looked at him. The core is drawing more energy. Daniel frowned. How much? Too much. The room became silent. The 12 stabilizers were still active. The test had ended. But the Genesis core was behaving differently now. Something inside it had awakened. Or perhaps, something had finally been allowed to move. Daniel stared at the readings. Then he saw it. A pattern. Hidden beneath the energy surge. A sequence. Repeated. Again. And again. And again. Daniel's expression changed. Lyra noticed. What is it? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He zoomed in. The sequence wasn't random. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a malfunction. It was structured. Almost deliberate. Daniel whispered, This isn't a power surge. Lyra looked at him. Then what is it? Daniel stared at the ancient machine. His voice became almost inaudible. It's a message. And somewhere deep inside the Genesis core, something answered. The red alarms continued for 17 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Genesis core remained suspended inside its containment field, its enormous rings turning with unnatural precision. The energy readings continued climbing. Lyra stared at the console. Daniel, I see it. What is it? Daniel leaned closer to the display. The sequence repeated. A pulse. A pause. 3 short harmonic changes. Another pause. Then the same pattern again. It wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It wasn't a malfunction. It was structured. Daniel pointed toward the screen. Record everything. Lyra immediately began copying the raw data. Tavik moved closer. What are you looking for? I don't know yet. That isn't reassuring. Daniel smiled faintly. It wasn't supposed to be. He watched the sequence again. The pattern repeated every 43 seconds. Exactly. No variation. No drift. No interference. Daniel looked at Lyra. Does the sequence appear in the historical records? She searched. Nothing. Try acoustic records. Nothing. Energy fluctuations? Nothing. Maintenance logs? Nothing. Lyra shook her head. It isn't documented. Daniel nodded. That makes sense. Tavik looked confused. How does that make sense? Because nobody was listening for it. The room fell quiet. Daniel turned toward the observation glass. For thousands of years, engineers had measured energy, temperature, pressure, harmonic stability, structural stress, power consumption. They had measured everything they knew how to measure. But nobody had asked whether the machine was communicating. Daniel pointed toward the core. Run a harmonic decomposition. Lyra hesitated. Using what parameters? Daniel thought for a moment. None. She frowned. That's impossible. Then use the machine's own rhythm. Lyra stared at him. Daniel continued. Don't tell the data what we're looking for. Let it tell us. She began adjusting the analysis. The waveform expanded across the main display. At first it looked like meaningless noise. Then the software separated the frequencies. One layer, then another, then another. A pattern appeared. Lyra stopped breathing. What? Tavik stepped closer. The waveform had transformed. The pulses weren't simply repeating. They were grouped. A sequence of harmonic intervals. Daniel watched carefully. Convert the intervals into numbers. Lyra did. The screen changed. A series appeared. Then another sequence. Again and again. Tavik looked at Daniel. Those aren't coordinates. No. Frequency values? No. System identifiers? Daniel shook his head. He stared at the numbers. Then his eyes widened. Their maintenance positions. Lyra looked at him. What? Daniel pointed. Each number corresponds to a component position inside the original architecture. Tavik immediately pulled up the oldest surviving blueprint. He overlaid the sequence. One by one, the highlighted points appeared. 5 locations. Then another 5. Then another. Every location was part of the original Genesis core design. But they were no longer active. Or at least, they weren't supposed to be. Lyra whispered. These components were removed. Daniel looked at her. When? Different periods. Why? She opened the historical records. Because they were considered redundant. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. There it was. The missing piece. For thousands of years, engineers had been removing components they believed were unnecessary, while adding new systems to compensate for the changes those removals created. Daniel looked toward the Genesis core. It wasn't asking us to shut anything down. Lyra understood. It was asking us to put something back. Daniel nodded. Tavik stared at the blueprint. That would mean, yes. Daniel finished the sentence. The original machine wasn't incomplete. It had been altered. Again, and again, and again, until the original balance was almost impossible to recognize. The engineering complex erupted into activity. Teams searched archives. Technicians pulled old storage containers. Researchers opened databases that hadn't been accessed in centuries. Everywhere, engineers began looking for the missing components. The first component was found in an abandoned research station. The second had been repurposed as part of a planetary power grid. The third was sitting in a museum. The fourth had been destroyed decades ago. The fifth, nobody knew. Daniel stood over the recovered components. They looked disappointingly ordinary. Small metal structures, old connectors. Nothing about them suggested they belonged inside the most important machine in the galaxy. Lyra picked one up carefully. This is it? Daniel nodded. Probably. That's disappointing. Daniel smiled. Most important things are. They began comparing the recovered components with the original architectural records. The more they discovered, the clearer the pattern became. The original Genesis core wasn't designed to be controlled. It was designed to balance itself. The ancient engineers had built a system capable of adapting to changes in energy, mass, and harmonic pressure. But later civilizations didn't understand that principle. They saw the machine correcting itself and assumed it was unstable. So they added stabilizers, then more stabilizers, then systems to correct the stabilizers. Eventually, the machine had become trapped inside an enormous web of artificial corrections. Every system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, and together, they were preventing the original system from functioning. Daniel looked at the timeline. 3,000 years, thousands of engineers, millions of modifications, all because someone had misunderstood one simple thing. The machine wasn't failing. It was compensating. Lyra looked at him. So how do we restore it? Daniel didn't answer. He stared at the missing component list. There were 5. They had 4. The 5th was still missing. Where is the last one? Lyra searched every database. Nothing. She checked historical transportation records. Nothing. Then she searched archaeological inventories. Still nothing. Daniel looked at the original blueprint. One component was marked with an ancient symbol. Not a number. Not a technical identifier. A symbol. Lyra translated the ancient text. Her face changed. What? She looked at Daniel. It says, she hesitated. Do not replace. Daniel stared at the symbol. Why? I don't know. Find out. Lyra searched again. Minutes passed. Then she stopped. I found a reference. Daniel turned. Where? An old maintenance report. She opened the document. The text was more than 2,000 years old. The report described an early attempt to remove the 5th component. The engineers had failed. Not because the component was physically attached, because the machine wouldn't allow them to remove it. Daniel read the final line. What does it say? Lyra translated. The core refuses the correction. Daniel slowly smiled. So it was still protecting itself. Tavik looked uneasy. Then why has nobody found the component? Daniel looked at the blueprint. Maybe because it isn't missing. Silence. What do you mean? Daniel pointed toward the center of the diagram. The 5th component wasn't listed among the external systems. It wasn't part of the auxiliary architecture. It wasn't a removable module. It was inside the central harmonic chamber, at the very heart of the Genesis core. Lyra's expression changed. That chamber has never been opened. Daniel nodded. I know. No civilization has accessed it in recorded history. I know. It may not even be possible. Daniel looked at her. There it is again. What? The word. Lyra stared at him. Daniel smiled. Impossible. Tavik stepped closer. You cannot enter the central chamber. Daniel looked through the glass. I don't think we're supposed to enter it. Then what are you proposing? Daniel watched the Genesis core. The machine pulsed again. The same sequence. The same message. But this time, Daniel noticed something new. The final pulse was different. It wasn't part of the sequence. It came afterward. A single harmonic burst. Daniel stared. Then he whispered, It's not telling us where the component is. Lyra looked at him. Then what is it telling us? Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the machine. Went to open the chamber. The room fell silent. The Genesis core pulsed again. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then stopped. Daniel looked at the countdown clock. The next pulse came exactly 30 seconds later. He understood. The machine wasn't simply communicating. It was giving them a window. A brief moment when the internal harmonic field would naturally align. A moment when the central chamber could potentially be opened without damaging the core. Lyra stared at the timing. You're saying the machine is helping us repair itself. Daniel shook his head. No. He smiled. I think it's been waiting for us to stop fighting it. Outside the observation deck, the Genesis core continued rotating. For the first time in 3,000 years, its rhythm sounded almost peaceful. But Daniel knew they weren't finished. Finding the missing component was one problem. Reaching it was another. And opening the central chamber might be the most dangerous thing anyone had ever attempted. Because if Daniel was wrong, they wouldn't simply damage the Genesis core. They could destroy the machine that held the galaxy together. And this time, there would be no second attempt. The countdown reached 0. The Genesis core changed. Not dramatically. Not violently. Just enough. The enormous outer ring slowed until, for one brief moment, every moving component aligned perfectly. Daniel stood inside the control chamber. Around him, engineers waited in complete silence. Nobody was talking now. Nobody was arguing. Even the alarms had been silenced. There was only the sound of the machine. One deep pulse. Then another. Lyra looked at the readings. Central harmonic alignment is stable. Daniel nodded. Open the access field. Tavik immediately stepped forward. We have one chance. Daniel looked at him. I know. If the containment field destabilizes. I know. If the harmonic pressure rises. I know. Tavik stopped. Daniel smiled. You don't have to convince me to be afraid. That earned the smallest smile from Tavik. Then he stepped away. The central chamber began to open. For 3,000 years, nobody had seen what was inside. The outer shell separated. Ancient metal moved aside. A field of blue-white energy appeared. Daniel stared through it. And there it was. The missing component. Suspended at the very center of the Genesis core. Not broken. Not damaged. Not corroded. Perfect. It had been there the entire time. The original harmonic regulator. The component every civilization had unknowingly spent thousands of years replacing with layers of artificial stabilization. Lyra whispered, it never needed to be replaced. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked at the component. It needed to be left alone. The realization hit everyone at once. The Genesis core had never been waiting for someone to invent a better system. It had been waiting for someone to stop adding systems. Daniel approached the chamber. A warning appeared. Harmonic pressure rising. Lyra looked at him. You have 30 seconds. Daniel nodded. He stepped forward. The chamber opened wider. Energy moved around him. His jacket began to vibrate. The air itself seemed to hum. Daniel reached toward the regulator. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then, the machine pulsed. The same sequence. The same message. But this time Daniel understood it. Not words. Not language. Instruction. He adjusted the regulator by a fraction. The Genesis core responded. Another fraction. The energy field changed. The outer rings began rotating faster. Then slower. Then faster again. Daniel watched the readings. It's correcting itself. Lyra stared at the monitors. Daniel, the harmonic field is stabilizing. He didn't answer. He made one final adjustment and released the regulator. The chamber closed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire Genesis core went dark. Every light disappeared. Every display dropped to zero. The engineering complex fell into darkness. Someone gasped. Lyra froze. Daniel. Then, a single pulse. Deep. Powerful. Clean. The Genesis core illuminated. The outer rings began rotating. Perfectly. Smoothly. Without a single correction system fighting against them. Every monitor in the room turned green. One after another. Energy stability. Optimal. Harmonic balance. Optimal. Thermal distribution. Optimal. Structural stress. Optimal. Lyra stared at the screens. I've never seen numbers like this. Tavik looked at the readings. Neither have I. Daniel stepped out of the chamber. His hands were shaking slightly. Lyra noticed. You all right? Daniel looked at his hands. Yeah. He smiled. Just getting old. She laughed. Then the main display changed. A message appeared. Not from the engineers. Not from the council. From the Genesis core itself. The ancient system translated the harmonic sequence into modern language. Only 4 words appeared. Balance restored. Nobody spoke. Then another line appeared. External corrections unnecessary. Tavik stared at it. For thousands of years, civilizations had built increasingly complicated systems to control the Genesis core. And the machine had just told them something painfully simple. Stop. The council was watching remotely. High Director Sin appeared on the main screen. His expression was completely different from the day Daniel had first entered the chamber. There was no skepticism, no irritation, no superiority, only respect. Daniel Carter. Daniel looked up. Yes, Director? Sin paused. I owe you an apology. Daniel smiled. You're not the first. A few people laughed. Even Sin smiled. Then his expression became serious. What did you actually do? Daniel looked toward the Genesis core. I didn't fix it. Sin frowned. Then what did you do? Daniel thought about the question, then answered. I stopped fixing the wrong thing. Silence. It was the simplest explanation, and perhaps the most uncomfortable, because the entire crisis had been built around one assumption. The Genesis core was broken. Once everyone believed that, every solution became a variation of the same idea. More control, more stabilization, more correction, more complexity. But Daniel had approached the machine differently. He hadn't asked, how do we control it? He had asked, what is it trying to do? That question changed everything. Within hours, engineers began dismantling unnecessary stabilization systems. Not all at once. Carefully, system by system. Each removal was tested. Each change was monitored. And every time another unnecessary correction disappeared, the Genesis core became more stable. The work continued for months. The galaxy didn't collapse. Transportation lanes remained open. Trade continued. Medical shipments continued. Colonies remained connected. But the engineering community changed. Universities changed their training. Research institutions changed their methods. Engineers were taught something they had forgotten. A machine doesn't always need more control. Sometimes it needs less interference. And Daniel? He returned to Earth. He went back to the same small workshop where he had spent years repairing machines nobody else wanted. The old truck was still there. His father's truck. Daniel stood beside it for a while. Then he opened the hood. The engine coughed. He smiled. You're still doing that? The truck coughed again. Daniel laughed. He picked up a wrench. And somewhere across the galaxy, millions of lights continued moving through ancient transportation lanes. The Genesis core was stable. Not because someone had made it more powerful. Not because someone had invented a better algorithm. Not because the smartest civilizations had finally created the perfect solution. It was stable because someone had finally asked a different question. Daniel looked at the old engine. His father's words came back to him. Every machine tells you what hurts, if you stop talking long enough. Daniel lowered the hood. And for the first time, he understood what his father had really meant. Engineering wasn't always about forcing a machine to obey. Sometimes, it was about learning how to listen. And perhaps that was the lesson the galaxy had needed for 3,000 years. The hardest problems don't always require smarter answers. Sometimes they require better questions. Because when everyone is asking, how do we fix this? The person who changes everything may simply be the one brave enough to ask. What if it was never broken?